what I'm going to talk about is scaling. A lot of you probably have noticed that there's a very interesting debate in Bitcoin today about how do we scale Bitcoin. And that's the topic I want to address, not from a technical perspective, but from a broader perspective, to understand what it means to scale. So gather around, and we'll talk about a long, long time ago. It was 1989, and the internet was dial-up. And not just the connection of users to the internet, the backbones of the internet, in most cases, were dial-up between universities, between research stations. There were a few permanent connections, high-speed connections, high-speed, 256 kilobits, 512 kilobits, high-speed connections. But the internet was mostly dial-up. Email had not yet really started to take hold, but there was a really special place on the internet called Usenet. Usenet was a discussion system, a system of discussion groups where you could post a message in text, and other people would see it, and then they would respond. But this was not instant messaging. This was slow messaging. Because in order for Usenet to work, all of the messages had to be transmitted via dial-up system and propagated from node to node in a system called store and forward, store and forward. So you'd post a message, it would take 24 hours, 48 hours to reach everyone, and then they could respond, and it would take 24 hours for you to see their response. Today, we would compare that to trying to communicate with Matt Damon on Mars as part of the Martian movie. And so at that time, there was a really big conversation among the engineers of the internet because Usenet was getting very popular, and it was getting very big. Kilobytes and then megabytes of text information that needed to be transmitted. And at first, these dial-up connections would take 30 minutes to an hour, but then they started getting longer and longer, and to get all of the Usenet messages would take 1 hour, 2 hours, and then 3 hours. And so all of the experts predicted, if you draw the point we are here, the point we were 6 months ago, and you connect them in a line, very soon it will take 26 hours to transmit 1 day's messages. And then we have a problem, because we only have 24. So what happens then? The internet will collapse. Clearly, it can't scale. It won't possibly scale. At the time, there were 2 parts to Usenet. There was the regular part of Usenet, which contained very carefully structured groups for academic discussion. And then there was another little part of Usenet called the alternative groups. And this was optional. You could carry it if you wanted to. You didn't have to carry it. So if you were a Usenet provider and you made these groups available, the really interesting providers offered the alt groups. And of course, all of the interesting stuff was in the alt groups. Some of the early amazing groups, alt folklore computing, alt security, and of course, like everything else that's been driving scale on the internet, alt sex. And these alternative groups, being optional, were the focus of this great debate. Should we carry them? Because at this point, we've started seeing the world's first spam. I remember receiving the first spam. It was a message posted by a Los Angeles lawyer firm that was posted to every Usenet group. And you did not do that. That was not cool. About 1,000 people told them it was not cool. That was the first internet backlash. And so the discussion was, do we carry alt groups? Because if we carry alt groups, the internet will surely melt down. And there's no way it can ever scale. If this becomes popular, people will discuss more. And if they discuss more, we won't have enough capacity to deal with this data. This conversation lasted for more than 2 years. And there were a few brave service providers that carried the alt groups. And they used massive hard drives, 5 megabyte hard drives that were the size of, you know, a very big thing. And again, the main idea was if you take where we are here and where we're going, up there we hit a wall. So the internet couldn't scale. That was the basic beginning of the scaling issue on the internet, and it couldn't scale and wouldn't scale, clearly. And many people wrote their PhDs on why it wouldn't scale. But of course, the thing is, networks don't scale. Networks fail to scale. And some networks fail to scale gracefully for decades. And those are the ones that succeed. So we solved the Usenet problem. The digital connections were upgraded, more systems connected with leased lines and direct connections. Dial-up gradually got replaced by leased lines. People started investing in the infrastructure. And we could comfortably carry Usenet. So people started using email. And we started the problem all over again, because now email started getting popular. And as email got popular, it started replacing and eclipsing the size of Usenet. Now we had an even bigger problem, because people wanted to communicate directly. Now a message didn't take 24 hours. It took 2 hours to cross the internet, which meant that people started having real-time conversations, well, near real-time. So email started exploding. And so the internet couldn't scale, because if you look to where email is today and where it was 6 months ago, and you draw a line, it will melt down. And people wrote more PhD theses about how the internet would die under the load of email and never scale. But then gradually, we started optimizing that and solved it. So we solved the email problem. And when I say we, I was watching, because I was just a 16-year-old who didn't know what the hell was going on. But we as people, as humanity, we solved the problem. So we scaled it. So the internet failed to scale for Usenet, and then it succeeded to scale for Usenet so that it could fail to scale for email. And then it succeeded in scaling for email. So some smart-ass idiot went and invented MIME, multimedia internet messages, which meant that you could attach things to email. And these attachments were 10 times the size of the text, because people started sending bigger things like drawings and pictures. And of course, once again, sex. So we could scale for email, but not for email attachments. So everybody was up in an uproar. We're never going to be able to scale for email attachments. The internet will surely melt down. And then we solved it until some British guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who then was just Tim, invented the web. And now you could put the pictures into frames. This was about 1992. I downloaded and ran the first web browser, NCSA Mosaic, at my university lab. We gathered together 3, 4 friends. We worked for hours to get NCSA Mosaic downloaded and compiled and installed. And then we launched it. And we visited the web. All of it. I can say a sentence not many people can say, because in 1992, I visited the entire web in an afternoon. Both sites. Because there were 2. And I visited both sites. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be huge. Huge. The internet will never scale. And just imagine what you can do with sex on the web. Of course, this became the scaling application, as we all know. It's been driving internet development since, but we don't talk about that in polite company. So then the internet was failing to scale for the web. And people say, we can never do all of these images and hypertext documents, and it will totally fail to scale. And more PhDs were written and more discussion. And the internet was still failing to scale. But by now, it had been failing to scale for more than a decade, very gracefully, very successfully. So then some idiot invented voice over IP. And now some other people decided, why don't we just replace the entire phone system with the internet? Now that was a crazy idea. So the phone companies then started this massive campaign to inform us of why packet switch networks could never carry voice. And really, the true quality approach to voice was always going to be hierarchical switch networks owned by national monopoly telecom companies, because the internet couldn't possibly scale to carry the world's phone calls. Those same companies now route all of the phone calls over the internet. So first, they didn't want the internet on their phone networks. Then they allowed the internet on the phone networks. Then they built their phone networks on top of the internet. And then we started sending videos. And then the internet couldn't scale again, because YouTube was going to melt down the internet clearly. And we needed some content quality and filtering, because we can't allow every idiot to go and publish a video about their cat, because there are already 1,000 cat videos. And if you draw a line from how many cat videos there were yesterday to how many cat videos there are today, and you extrapolate, by the end of this decade, there will be 1 billion cat videos on the internet, which is exactly what happened. Pardon me. But we scaled. And now we do 3D video and 4K video, and then Netflix came along. And so we see the same mistake, which was that in 1992, when I visited the first website, my thought was, wow, TV is so dead. Because one day, we will be able to transmit movies instantaneously. Now, if you go and say that to a respectable network researcher in 1992, they call you an idiot. Because clearly, if we had Netflix in 1992, a single video stream to a single user would melt down the entire internet. And yet, here we are today. And by the way, the internet is failing to scale for Netflix and all of the other companies that are doing live video, and it will continue to fail to scale incrementally and gracefully, and soon we'll be doing Oculus Rift holographic 3D 4K VR. And then it will really fail to scale, and people will still write PhD theses on why the internet is about to melt down. And the reason for this is really simple. It is because scale is not a goal to achieve. It is the definition of what can you do with the network today. And the moment you increase the capacity, the very definition of what can you do with the network today changes. Because somebody says, hang on a second, you mean I can now do X, which has 10 times more demand than what I did before? Let's do some of that. And then you fail to scale again. So scaling is a moving target. Scale defines the edge of today's capability. And as it moves forward, capability increases. Bitcoin is failing to scale. And if we're really, really lucky, Bitcoin will continue to fail to scale gracefully for 25 years, just like the internet. Because the very same types of companies that then were saying the internet can never work for all of the email, it can never work to do quality voice calls, it could never work to do quality video. The same kind of corporate arguments are now being said, so why Bitcoin can never do retail payments, it can never do Visa scale, it can never do global scale, and if it's actually adopted, it will collapse. And right now, there are a dozen people writing their PhD thesis on why Bitcoin will fail, has failed, is dying, was dead, and has died again. There's a beautiful site called bitcoinobituaries.com where you can read the pronouncements of the death of Bitcoin since 2009 regularly, like clockwork, every 3 to 6 months. Major newspapers, scientists, etc., saying, OK, that's it, Bitcoin is dead. In fact, this has now become an amazing recruitment opportunity. Because all you have to do is wait for people to hear first that Bitcoin died. The CEO of Bitcoin was arrested. Bitcoin was shut down by Putin. And then 4 months later, someone says, you know, there's some interesting new applications on Bitcoin. And they go, Bitcoin's still there? Bitcoin is still there is the marketing slogan of this community. If we can just keep doing Bitcoin is still there, people are surprised. They are confounded. It doesn't match their expectations. It's not possible that Bitcoin is still there because very serious people with very serious titles working for very rich companies told them that Bitcoin would not still be there. But Bitcoin is still there because we are failing to scale gracefully. When we fail to scale during a stress test or a capacity test, when the network is flooded with transactions, what happens? Some users experience a terrible situation. They do a transaction with 0.1 millibits like they've always done, and it takes 3 days to confirm. And during that time, they're freaking out, especially if they're new users, because new users assume that the money has left their account. There are no accounts in Bitcoin. And is en route to the destination account. Again, there are no accounts in Bitcoin. And therefore is somewhere in limbo in between. But the money is really still in their account. It's just that their wallet says it hasn't been confirmed yet. Right? It's either at the source or at the destination atomically with one transaction. There is no intermediate state. It can't be in limbo because Bitcoin doesn't transmit. It settles. So we experience these sudden problems. And some wallets behave intelligently, and they increase their fees, sometimes by 100%. So, oh, woe is me. Instead of it costing 4 cents to send a global transaction in seconds anywhere around the world with full censorship resistance and open innovation and open access to everyone, it takes 7 cents to send that transaction. And clearly, this is an indication, together with the people who had 3 days to confirm the transaction, that Bitcoin surely is dead now. And some of the developers go, I give up. Bitcoin's dead. And the newspapers write, Bitcoin is dead. Transactions are not going through. Transactions are going through. They went through for me. I was running a wallet that was intelligent. It was doing its transaction calculations. But what happens in the aftermath of this capacity crunch? We get better wallets. And that's really the essence of a dynamic system responding to pressure. Because as we get better wallets, these better wallets calculate fees more correctly. And it's a lot easier to jam the network if there's a lot of dumb wallets doing 0.1 millibit fees. Because then all you have to do is do 0.11 millibit fees, and you are king of the hill, because the other idiots didn't update. And you jam the network with your transactions. But if they're able to do 0.12 millibits, now you have to do 0.13. And now we're in a race. And before you know it, you're spending 0.5 millibits, oh dear, on a transaction, which, of course, if you're a legitimate user, is nothing. If you're trying to jam, the network starts getting really expensive really fast. Which brings up an interesting question. What is a spam transaction? What is a legitimate transaction? What is an illegitimate transaction? There are 2 ways to answer this. One is a paternalistic, top-down approach that says, this is what is allowed, this is what is not allowed, and by making a list, we will prevent the network from filling to capacity. But that breaks the fundamental capability of Bitcoin, which is net neutrality. Bitcoin doesn't care who the sender or the receiver is, what the application is, what the value of the transaction is. All it cares about is, did you pay the fee? And if you paid the fee, your transaction is legitimate by definition, because you thought it was legitimate enough to attach that fee. The very act of paying the fee legitimizes the transaction, because if we start making decisions about what is spam and what is not, we are now choosing the future of Bitcoin and constraining it into a set of applications that we can imagine. And the brilliant person who creates the application we can't imagine, that may look like spam to us, doesn't get carried across the network because we made a top-down decision to say that transaction is illegitimate. And the other way of doing this is to say, how about we use a market to solve this problem? We have a market, we have a currency, use the market to solve this problem, and allow the market to establish the minimum fee that meets the requirements of supply through the miners and their need for propagating blocks fast, and the demand of the users for the applications they care about. And if you pay the fee, your transaction is legitimate. There is no spam transaction. There is no such thing as an illegitimate transaction. There are only transactions that did get mined and transactions that didn't have enough fee to get mined. And so this is how Bitcoin is going to play out. And this is not going to be solved. It's not going to be solved because we will have the scaling discussion every year for decades into the future, hopefully. And every year we will fail to scale for the next application and succeed to scale for the previous ones. And as soon as we do better, people will invent new applications, and we will fail to scale again. The internet, failing to scale gracefully for 25 years. Bitcoin, let's keep failing to scale gracefully. And Bitcoin is not yet dead. Thank you.